Hey folks, hope everybody's doing well. Today you get to listen to me talk. Hooray! I'll just give you a second to stop clapping. I know you're so excited for this. No, just kidding. It shouldn't be too bad. Let's get this done. Today you are going to learn about a little bit more, I guess I should say, about kingdom fungi. Fungi, 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 like David Suzuki said, who knows how you say it. Something like that. I feel like I should be making a bad dad joke about being a fun guy. Blech. It's okay. I'll spare you. I'll spare you. Here's what we can say about funguses in general. So some general information. These cells that make up funguses are all eukaryotic. So remember when we looked at kingdom Monera, that was the bacteria. They were a little bit different, a little bit special because they were prokaryotic cells. They did not have nuclei. They did not have membrane-bound organelles. But then we moved into the protists. Last week we saw that they were eukaryotic as well. So are the funguses, so are going to be the animals and plants that we look at later. The difference between the funguses and the protists that we looked at last week is now we're looking at organisms that are multicellular. So what that means compared to the protists, which were unicellular, where the living organism was just a single little cell. And maybe they hung out with some friends, maybe they kind of got together, but they were still individual little cells. The organism was only one cell big. Now with multicellular organisms, we have many different types of specialized cells. So many types of cells. And maybe I'll put in brackets here that we do have the specialization piece. There are different cells performing different functions in the body of this organism. So many types of cells with specialization make up a single organism. Now, that fits for the vast majority of kingdom fungi, but there is one kind of fungus that you learned about in the video that a lot of people don't really know that it's included with the funguses, and it's actually singular or unicellular. It just hangs out by itself. So there is one exception to this rule. Do I ever feel like an adult? Hey, there's a rule, but here's an exception. The exception is the yeasts. And those yeasts, we're hopefully going to be able to look at some of them on Friday or Monday next week. The yeasts are unicellular. So they're a little bit more like protists in that way. Now these funguses, this entire kingdom, hopefully you remember from the video that they are not animals, because that's kingdom Animalia. They are not plants. That's kingdom Plantae. These things are their own kingdom. They're totally unique, but they do have characteristics that make them animal-like, even though they're not animals. And that characteristic, the main one, is that they are heterotrophic. So I think a lot of people probably look at funguses and think that they're like plants. I bet you a lot of students, or especially younger kids, would probably think, yeah, a mushroom is a type of plant. But it's not. It's a fungus. Funguses are not plants and they're not animals. But they are heterotrophic like animals. And maybe I'll even put that they're heterotrophic only. You do not find photosynthetic funguses. Although we're going to see a cool relationship that funguses have with something photosynthetic. We'll chat about that in a little bit. But they're only heterotrophic. That means they have to find a food source. And in terms of how they do that, they can be saprophytic. We saw that term with bacteria. We saw that term with protists. And I can't hear you because this is only a video, but everybody's shouting it out for the TOC. You're saying, hey, we know what that is. That means they're decomposers. And they play a huge role decomposing things in forests. That's a massively important role that occurs in forest ecosystems that's performed by the funguses. It's important in other places too, but certainly in the forest. This time of year, all the leaves are falling off the trees. If we don't madly rake them up and put them in plastic bags, if we just leave them alone, they're going to sit on the ground, they'll get covered in snow, and then magically, the snow will melt and the leaves will be gone. Where did they go? Oh, they got broken down by lots of these funguses, lots of the bacteria, lots of the protists, recycling those nutrients. Very good for the environment. Some of these funguses can be parasitic. So that means they feed on a host. And you saw that in the video yesterday, that there are actually more funguses that go after other organisms, like especially insects. If you want, you should look up, maybe get the TOC to look up a video on something called cordyceps. I think it's spelled like this, if you want to look it up on YouTube when this video is done. Pretty gnarly fungus that goes after insects. Actually takes over their minds and makes them do weird stuff. Thankfully, that doesn't go after people. There are very few really bad fungal infections that we can get that would be really harmful. We will see that most of the fungal infections that occur in people are just skin-based, where they just sit on the surface. Because like David Suzuki taught you yesterday in the video, it turns out that our internal body temperature at about 37 degrees is too warm for most funguses to grow nicely. So we've kind of made a deal with funguses in an evolutionary sense that we don't really do anything to them. We leave them alone. We'll use them a little bit. We'll chat about that in a moment. But they kind of leave us alone too, mammals. With the exception of things like bats, who when they hibernate, their internal body temperature goes down, they can actually get sick. And believe it or not, some of these funguses can actually be predators. We're going to talk about parts of their structure that can actually grow quite quickly and maybe go after microscopic little worms and things like that. So they're not predators on people, obviously, but on other very small organisms. And just really quickly, let's hit a couple of uses. So funguses can be quite useful for us as people. Those yeasts especially, the exception to the multicellular rule, they are used in all bread and beer making. You know what bread's all about. Beer's an adult drink. You're going to learn about that one day. They are also, we've chatted about this already, penicillin and a lot of its derivatives are funguses and they're antibiotics. They're used to kill bacteria. And then there's other medicines that we get from them as well. And I don't remember the stat from the video, but I think in that David Suzuki video, they mentioned something like 10 of our most common medications are based on funguses, something crazy like that. So very useful in keeping us healthy or making us healthy when we're sick. And then they're a food source. Some of you may or may not like mushrooms or molds. Molds are also used in some food production, like some of the gnarlier cheeses that I'm not a huge fan of, like blue cheese, if you've ever seen that. It's basically just covered in mold. I am no cheese connoisseur, so don't trust what I say. But I don't know that I would eat super moldy rank cheese. But hey, if you want to eat some, if you say it's delicious, go for it. I'm just some weirdo that plays with Christmas lights. Okay, so we'll leave that for uses. Let's keep rolling. Let's talk about the structure. This should all be a review from last day. But these are terms you definitely want to know. The first one we'll talk about is the mycelium. The mycelium is what we call the body of the fungus. So that's what makes up most of the mass of the fungus. We don't actually see the mycelium unless you go like digging in the dirt because it's under the surface. Under the surface or under the ground. And really it makes this kind of white, stringy looking mat that's made out of another part of the fungus that we're going to mention. So I'm going to throw a term at you that you probably heard in the video, but I'm going to explain this in a moment. It is a tangled and very dense mat of hyphae. So we'll see hyphae as a sort of structure that funguses send out in search of food. They're little string-like, single-cell thick strands, but when they get all tangled up and really matted up on themselves, they make an actual structure under the dirt, and that's called the mycelium. It's a little bit like how people make dreadlocks, right? Big, thick masses of hair, but they're made out of individual, thin, tiny little hairs that just get all matted together to make a thicker structure. So that's the body of the fungus. So I just mentioned that term hyphae. Let's talk about those, because they really are kind of sort of the same thing. Or one's made out of the other. Maybe that's what I should say. The hyphae are, I'm putting this in air quotes, right? Because it's not actually a root, but a lot of people say they're like the roots of a fungus. It turns out the biological definition of roots is something that's only in plants. But these are doing kind of the same job as roots in plants. They kind of look the same. So these are thin filaments that grow out in search of food. Grow in search of food. Now, because funguses are heterotrophic, they're not like a plant that can just sort of throw some leaves up into the air and collect sun energy and turn that into glucose or sugars. They actually have to go out into search of food. And if food's not around them, they have to just grow hyphae that are longer. And if they sort of tap out that food source, they got to just keep growing. So the analogy is that the actual fungus can't move itself. So that would be like if you were sitting on your couch at home and you were hungry, but you couldn't get off your couch. This probably actually sounds like some of you. Just kidding. So you're sitting on your couch, you're hungry, so you just start growing your arms out. And your arms just grow and grow and grow, and eventually they grow into your kitchen. And you open up the fridge and you get some food and you eat that. And then a while later you get hungry again. And you're thinking, geez, I already tapped the fridge, so maybe your arms grow a little bit longer and they go into like your pantry. If you've got some dry food somewhere and you tap that food source, and then you're still hungry. So your arms just keep growing, and then they grow over to the neighbor's house. Then they grow out to the next neighbor's house. They get longer and longer. Maybe they grow over to like Safeway or Save-On, whatever's closer, depending on where you live. But you've never left the couch. You've just got these long arms, these things going out in search of food, your hyphae, and they just keep growing until you find food. They're pretty wild. Kind of fun to think if it was the same for us. And these hyphae, they're only one cell thick. So they are very, very fine, fragile, thin things. So if we were to sketch them, so there's my little hyphae, they're actually just a series of cells that are joined end to end. So individual hyphae are very small. We'll put little nuclei in there to make them look like cells. And that thing would extend out in both directions. And then eventually this thing just grows these hyphae out everywhere, and it sends them out in all directions, and they get really thick and tangled up. And when it does that, we say, oh, look, it's a mycelium now, right? Many of them make a big body of a fungus under the ground. These things, we'll keep rolling. Another interesting fact about funguses is their cell wall. It is made of a neat material that we're going to hear about again. It's made of something called chitin. Now, what's really cool about chitin is it makes up the exoskeleton of insects. Exoskeleton of insects. So when we chatted last week about diatoms and we said, hey, if you grind them up into diatomaceous earth, they can slice open the exoskeletons of insects and that causes them to leak their fluids out and they die. That actual exoskeleton, the shell, the hard part of the crunchy part, if you've eaten these, of things like ants and spiders, is made up of chitin, the same thing that makes up the cell wall of funguses. Does that mean that insects evolved from funguses since they contain the same protein, the same material called chitin? And the answer is no. Why would they both be made of chitin? Well, it's because it's useful in terms of providing actual solid structure to those organisms. So it's a good example of convergent evolution. They do not share a common ancestor, but they have evolved the same structure because it works in their habitat. And just to compare really quickly, you and I as animals don't have cell walls, but plant cell walls, just so you can see that they're actually different. This is why, again, they're not considered plants. Plant cell walls are made of something called cellulose. Whoa. Whoa. Okay, we're going to keep going. This is a one-shot deal. I have no editing in this very basic program. Sorry about that. So the cell walls are made of something called cellulose. So different organisms in a different kingdom, they have cell walls made out of different stuff. Cellulose, actually, you know it by a different name. It's an undigestible for humans part of the plant. So the part that we don't digest, that helps us poop regularly, stay regular, is called fiber. So things like all bran and cereals and some of your wheat-based products have lots of undigestible cellulose. We say that they have lots of fiber. The last thing I'll hit with structure here is what we probably think of when we think of funguses, and that's the mushroom. And the mushroom is simply just the reproductive structure of a fungus. Another thing that you'll hear with that term reproductive structure is it's called a fruiting body. They might have mentioned that in the video. And that mushroom, the reproductive structure, it reproduces with spores. So it produces tiny little things called spores, a little bit different than a sperm or an egg, but it releases lots and lots of them, typically carried around by wind or moisture. That would then grow into another fungus. So let me try. I'm no artist. I apologize for this, but let's sketch a mushroom, kind of your token mushroom. So we're going to say that's the stalk, and maybe we'll make the ground brown there. So there's a stalk. It's a little sort of roundish part on the top. Ooh, this puts the pressure on me. No editing. That's not bad. Looks like that. There's all these really little folds inside. If you've never looked at the underside of a mushroom, do the next time you buy some for dinner. Looks kind of cool. The top is called the cap. The underside with all the little folded sections are called the gills, and that's where the spores are produced. So those make spores. And we have the stalk. It's kind of like the tree trunk. Holds the mushroom cap up because it wants to be off the ground so it can disperse those spores. And then you would have your hyphae and your mycelium underneath. The majority of it actually is underneath the dirt. You don't really see it. So I don't know how. I should be drawing this way thicker and way more little parts spreading out, but I'll stop there. Because again, that mycelium is made up of many, many, many hyphae. So here, let's just call this the hyphae / mycelium. So single-celled thick strands going out in search of food that get all matted up and get called a mycelium. Okay, and everybody loves to eat mushrooms. Actually, if you don't, that's fine. I don't mind them. They're okay on stuff. Let's quickly chat about, in slightly more detail, that reproduction piece. We mentioned it's via spores, but there's a little more to the story. These things, like many of the protists, like bacteria, can reproduce asexually. So they don't need a mate. And that option is budding and fragmentation. So they bud or produce a new version of themselves, an identical copy, and then that fragments or breaks off. What that looks like in practice is the hyphae can sort of break off. It separates, and then it grows into a new fungus. So if we go back to that analogy of you growing your arms out in search of food, it'd be like if you could break one of your arms off and then that arm just turned into another version of you somewhere else. Again, very strange to think about it with people, but it works great for these funguses. Do keep in mind that with any type of asexual reproduction, we're talking identical copies. Good if you want to grow, not so good if you're looking for long-term survival, because there's no increase in genetic diversity. So in order to take care of that piece and make sure that there is genetic diversity, there is a sexual option. And that sexual option is with the spores. Now the spores are something called haploid. That means they contain half the number of chromosomes as the sort of parent organism. Half the chromosomes. Just like human sperm and egg, they're haploid as well. You and I have 46 chromosomes in our body cells, but sperm and egg cells only have 23. Half the number, haploid. HA, haploid, HA, half. So what ends up happening, is those haploid spores, they land on the ground, they start to grow hyphae, the root-like structures. Hyphae from two different spores that are growing, two genetically different individuals. The hyphae will meet and fuse together. And then they grow into a new fungus. Now what's cool is because you've taken half the chromosomes from one and half the chromosomes from the other, they're now a full set of chromosomes, or two sets combined. We call them diploid. And there is genetic diversity that's gone up because you just combine the genetics of two organisms. And we've chatted about this before. Old news, Heinrich, old news. Cool, almost there, guys, almost there. Thanks for hanging in there. Little bit weird when it's just a video. I wish I was here being able to show you videos and have some fun, but that's okay. To finish off the day, or the lesson anyways, there are some different types or classes of fungi. Now, I made you this deal for the protists. I'll make you this deal again for the funguses. You don't have to memorize the names. You just have to be able to match the different types of funguses with their different characteristics. So we'll do a quiz at some point, and it's simply a matching thing. In no particular order, there is a group of funguses called Zygomycota. And this group of funguses you are going to be very familiar with because these are your bread and food molds. So if you've ever gone to make yourself a grilled cheese sandwich and you found the bread to be moldy, that is Zygomycota that's growing on there. Same thing with your cheeses and any kind of fruits or veggies. And they actually make up a lot of soil fungi as well. Now I have no idea how long this video is. It's probably too long already. But remind me when I get back to tell you a story about zucchini cake. So Zygomycota, Z for Zygomycota, Z for zucchini cake. It will help you remember. Yeah, there was some moldy cake one time that I may or may not have eaten. Yeah, just maybe a lot of it. Anyways, another story for another day. You'll get a kick out of it. Remind me to tell you because I'll forget. Group number 2. A group called Basidiomycota. This group makes up all your quote-unquote mushrooms that you're going to buy at the grocery store. So your nice white-capped mushrooms. I think they're even called that, button cap or white-cap mushrooms, like the one that we sketched. They also include things called shelf funguses. I'll make it plural, shelf fungi. Those are the ones, you don't have to sketch this, but they're the ones that grow on trees. If you've ever seen this in the forest, you'll have a fungus that kind of grows off in that shape, especially on dead trees too that are on the ground. That's a shelf fungus. And then also puffballs. I don't know if they have these here in Penticton as much, but when I grew up in Armstrong, these things were all over in the lawn, especially late in the summer. Little brown balls that when you step on them, they just go poof. And they shoot like a brownish, whitish dust into the air, which is simply lots and lots and lots of spores. So these are pretty cool little things that just make spores en masse, and then simple little kids like Mr. Heinrich, even simple adults like Mr. Heinrich. If I see him, I'm going to stomp on him and spread those spores out, and I'm just doing the thing a favor, spreading those spores for it. Number 3 for our groups of funguses is something called Ascomycota. And this is actually the biggest group in terms of number of species, like 65-ish thousand species or something like that. It is what makes mildew. So I don't know if you know what mildew is. It's not as common here because it's so dry, but it grows a lot down on the coast. If you have like black stuff that grows in your shower, places where there's moisture, that's mildew. I'm not talking black mold. That's different. The stuff that can grow on your walls and potentially be harmful if you inhale it. This is just stuff that grows like in corners of windows that stay moist or in your bathtub or bathroom. Again, way more common down on the coast because it's so humid. I'll show you some pictures when I come back. And this group, they're big because they also include all the yeasts. So the different single-celled organisms that are used, for us anyway, to make bread and beer. But yeasts are really common in the environment too. There's other species of yeast that we don't use. So that's the biggest group by number. And the last one Another group that you maybe have familiarity with is called Deuteromycota. Notice all these groups finish with this mycota. And these are all the different skin funguses that humans get. So the best example, things like skin fungi. And what I'm talking about here, probably the one you're most familiar with, you may or may not have had it. I've had this before. It's called athlete's foot, where you get kind of flaky skin between your toes. Maybe gets a little bit sore. It also includes ringworm, which is a fungus that looks like you have a little worm under your skin, a little red circle. It is not actually a worm, it's a fungus. So the name is quite misleading, but that one's pretty common. And then the other one that I see on TV all the time, they're really advertised for it now, is toenail funguses. So any of those that live on human skin, those are in the group Deuteromycota. They're a little bit unsightly, but they're not going to kill you. In fact, I don't even think they're going to hurt you. You can transfer them, especially things like toenail fungus and athlete's foot. That's why we probably wear flip-flops in a public shower. But again, they're not going to hurt you. They're just there, and they look kind of gross. Anyways, I'll give you some more stories and examples of these things. There's your 4 groups of funguses. That takes us to the end. Oh, thank goodness. Thanks for hanging in there, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.